Hello and welcome to the New York Shakespeare Spotlight on Education series, and it is our Christmas special. That's right, it is the end of the year 2024, and we are at the holiday season. It is literally Christmas Eve right now as we are recording this discussion, and we hope that wherever you are safe and happy and healthy with your families, enjoying the holiday season. It is frigid out there, but we've got a red hot discussion coming up here tonight. We are talking about Shakespeare's Day and how Shakespeare and the Elizabethans celebrated Christmas. And we couldn't have better guests to discuss that with. We are with Carol and Lloyd of Shake Up History of the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics podcast. Hello, Carol Ann.
Hello.
And we have Paul Adrian Freed of the Hamlet Bible blog series. He's a very prolific writer. Hello, Paul Adrian.
Hello. Thank you,
All right.
Rodney.
So these are two of our favorite past guests who've appeared in our various discussions. Paul appeared in our Mother's Day discussion last year, and he gave some wonderful insights into the Shakespeare's mothers that appear in the various
Mhm.
plays. And you can go back and check that out in our YouTube channel, the Near Shakespeare YouTube channel. And Carol Ann just appeared about a month or so ago on a previous episode of our Shakespeare Spotlight on Education series. So you can go back and catch all of those past episodes, plus so many more across our social media, New York Shakespeare on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and elsewhere. And there's tons and tons of free content you can check out. But before you venture off to those archival recordings, stick with us here. We have a wonderful, fresh, new holiday themed discussion for you coming up. So we are, as we mentioned right at the top, we are talking about Christmas. We're talking about the year-end holidays and how that worked out in the days of Shakespeare in the Elizabethan era. So, Carol Ann, Paul, given that you are both experts in the field, Carol Ann is a renowned writer and historian. She has a recently released book, Courting the Virgin Queen, which delves into the history of Queen Elizabeth I, plus a previous volume, both of which wonderful books. And Paul has a prolific series of blog posts all about Shakespeare and the connections between Shakespeare's works, especially Hamlet and the Bible. So we couldn't have two better guests to help us sort our way through this discussion about Shakespeare and Christmas. So, what did, first of all, before we get into what Christmas looked like in Shakespeare's time, which plays of Shakespeare most capture the Christmas season and the Christmas spirit, shall we say?
Hmm. Good question.
Very good
Paul?
question.
I would observe that that's an interesting question, but it's one that could be taken in a variety of ways. One would be in how many plays is Christmas mentioned at all? And certainly it comes up as the twelfth night being the eve of the 12th day of Christmas in the title. But it's mentioned three times in two Christmas plays, once in Merry Wives of Windsor and twice in Love's Labour's Lost. My favorite when Barone says, "At Christmas I no more desire a rose than wish a snow in May's newfangled mirth." And then in Hamlet, Marcellus mentions the season in a way that would have been considered superstitious and pagan and more Catholic than Protestant, more shaped by superstitious tradition than by biblical truths. He says, some say that ever against that season comes wherein our Saviour's birth is celebrated. The bird of dawning singeth all night long, and then they say no spirit dares stir abroad. The nights are wholesome, then no planets strike, no fairy takes, nor witch hath power to charm. So hallowed and so gracious is this time. And then Horatio claims, politely, I think, that he half believes him. But this is probably not taking place in the season of Christmas, or I think Marcellus would have expressed disappointment that his superstitious faith had been proven wrong by the ghost's appearance. So that's not really uh, the season of Christmas. Some people say Merry Wives of Windsor. Well, it has that word Mary in the title, and so maybe that's got the spirit of Christmas. And there's all this, boy, Falstaff is having such a good and sinful time. It's kind of strange to say that that's in the spirit of Christmas, but there are some connections to like the Lord of Misrule and things like that.
Right, right, right. Carol
Yeah,
Ann?
yeah, one of the things about Christmas in general and theater or plays in general is that the Christmas season, Christmas tide, which would start, we have to remember, on December 25th. So I always like to remind people, I've been going to a few parties and have had some shopping extravaganzas, houses already decorated. None of that would have been the case in Shakespeare's time or in Elizabethan England. Everything started on Christmas Day. And the next 12 or so days were oftentimes of merrymaking, and that did include a lot of theatrical performances, particularly at court or in some of the grand homes. And so the very idea of plays might be associated for some people with Christmas simply because it was a time off work. It was the longest dedicated time off work for many people of the year. And if you were a courtier or if you were trying to gain favor with Elizabeth by showing up at court and presenting her with a gift and participating in that kind of thing, you might see a series of plays. So I think in some ways, the whole idea of theater might have some association with Christmas. And certainly, although if you look at the play Twelfth Night, there's a little bit of playing with the holidays, a little bit, I think, of anticipating the Puritan resistance to the holiday making that, we see playing out and then will certainly play out in the future. But I think all theater had just a sense of that Christmas time, because you might see more plays at Christmas during that short period of time than you might the whole rest of the year. So,
Okay. All
Excellent
right.
observations. And, especially with Christmas really beginning on Christmas Day, they were busy fasting. I mean, Advent was like a season of Lent for them.
yes.
So they were busy with that up until Christmas.
Yeah. And it was a quarter day. It was one of the four quarter days where all things were due, your bills were due, your things were due on that day. So you had been working and making sure everything was in order so that your Christmas time could be one of festivity. So yeah, the Advent was a very busy time. It's busy for us, but in a very different way.
Now, just a quick editor's note, so to speak, or a video editor's note. Now, Carol Ann mentioned that they celebrated the Christmas Day as the first of 12 days of Christmas. We can kind of do that here as well, in the sense that Carol Ann has two wonderful books that you can buy as Christmas gifts for your loved ones. And even though tomorrow is Christmas by the time we record this, you can either run out to the store and pick those up, or you can order it in time for the 12th day of Christmas, which is when most people in the Elizabethan age would celebrate.
Well,
Yeah.
and New Year's Day, January 1st, was also a big gift giving day. And one of the marvelous things that we have from Elizabeth's reign, in addition to records of all the plays that were performed for her over that Christmas season, are the gifts that she gave and received. There are huge gift rolls, some in various places. I saw one that was from the British Library. I've seen one at Folger Shakespeare Library here in the DC area, and they list in order of precedence. If you were a highly ranked duke, you would be toward the top of the list. So you better be there on time to present your gift to the queen and then receive something in return. So, yes, gift giving was a good way to gain favor. And so it's not over yet. Don't worry if you don't have it yet, because you have a few days if you want to celebrate like a Tudor.
Okay. All
Oh,
right.
very good.
Now, going back to the idea of gift giving, that's something that we experience now as the part of the way we celebrate the year-end holidays. Everyone gives their Christmas gifts. What did Christmas look like in Shakespeare's era? Did they have Christmas trees that they all took to their houses? Did they have other things that are parallel to the observance that we have in the contemporary times now?
They didn't have Christmas trees. We see that a lot of people credit Prince Albert and Queen Victoria with the Christmas tree. We actually see Queen Charlotte bringing over some trees earlier on. It didn't catch on quite as well, but they would have, as a continuation of a pagan thing, they would have probably found a Yule log to bring into their home, bring that in on Christmas morning. If you were very carefully celebrating year to year, you would have saved some of the ashes from the previous year's Yule log that you would add to your fire as you kept the Yule log burning. And then when the Christmas season was over, you would save some for the next year. They would bring in some greenery to decorate the house, but this happened on Christmas morning. So part of the day was bringing some very natural greens. I mean, it sounds beautiful and lovely and fragrant to bring these things in fresh that morning. That's kind of fun.
And in some of the other things that we have now, like the Christmas wreath and any of those iconic things that we celebrate, or that are the manner in which we celebrate now, were any of those around in Shakespeare's day, or are all those later inventions?
Well, they did have a kissing bough, that sort of what we might look at as the mistletoe, which might be part of that. But there were some of those romantic notions that, yes, had a little bit of the traditions and the history and a little bit of the mythology, because Christmas was sort of put onto December 25th, which was a pagan holiday. So some of those traditions carried on. And each of the 12 days of Christmas had a very specific sort of theme or frame. Some days were more about feasting than others, but the idea of feasts and greenery and gathering family and friends was very much during Shakespeare's time.
I just
Okay.
read very recently, within the last week or so, that there's a historian named Dr. Julia Martins who talks about the Tudor recipes for mincemeat pies. And she talks about how the spices and ingredients in mincemeat pies, the last time I had mincemeat pie, it didn't have real meat in it. It was fruit and spices and stuff, but they would have meat in it. So if you had lamb in the mincemeat pie, well, Jesus is the Lamb of God, and they're the shepherds and all this. But also, the spices were related for Elizabethans to the gifts of the Magi, the gold and frankincense and myrrh. So this was, it's as if the Bible tale and the catechism is being built right into the recipe for the mincemeat pie. So, and I know very little about how those kinds of cultural connections worked, but I thought it was fascinating that Dr. Julia Martins would explore that and explain that.
So in that sense, Paul, with the mincemeat pie, with the lamb in some way representing Christ, is that another form of a Eucharist, the mincemeat pie?
Oh gosh, that's a wonderful connection. Yes, because I suppose if you're eating the host and if you're eating
Mhm.
the lamb and the pie, it does imply that kind of connection. But the Protestants might say, of course, that it's only a metaphor. It's not really transubstantiation or anything like that. But yes, interesting observation.
So that
That
brings us to, go ahead, Carolyn.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say that whole religious tension really could be acted out in what you ate and how you felt or thought about what you ate. As Paul just mentioned, that's a really great comment. Yeah.
Sure. And
So
it's also
so
interesting to me that the second day of Christmas, the 26th, I believe, is the Feast of Stephen. So a later hymn would be, Good King Wenceslas went out on the Feast of Stephen. And this is the story of the first Christian martyr. So you get this birthday of Jesus, and you get a baby in a manger and some nice little animals and shepherds and what. But then you get this story about a Christian young man being killed. Well, for Christendom, this seems to be a reminder that this infant is born to die for the salvation of all humankind. And it, yeah, and so we, especially if we uh, are not church, we don't, nobody has to go to church now. In Shakespeare's time, everybody was required by law to go to church, and they would make these kind of connections and associations. So, yes, so so if the theme of martyrdom seems to be coming up or feels like it's coming up, even though it might not be explicitly, overtly connected as an allusion to the Feast of Stephen or the crucifixion or anything, it's still part of that cultural fabric of religion and martyrdom and self-sacrifice.
So we hit on a couple of tensions here, a couple of areas of conflation of Christianity with the previous pagan religions, where it's absorbing some of the previous pagan traditions. But also, you're hitting into something interesting about the differences between observance in Protestants and Catholics. And I think that was one of the key areas of tension in Elizabethan England, because, of course, Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, had very famously separated from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Protestant Church of England. So you talked about people are being required to go to church. They are required to go to a Protestant church, and they are in
Yes,
mortal danger if they are found going to a Catholic church, right?
correct.
Now,
Mhm.
is there even a Catholic church left for them to go to, or are they outlawed and taken
There
down?
were secret,
See,
there were secret masses and priest holes where priests were hidden away in people's homes. But I was also going to add that the martyrdom of Stephen, certainly in during the reign of Elizabeth, the Protestants would be thinking of the Protestant martyrs killed under Catholic monarchs, and the Catholics might be thinking of the Catholics who were executed under Protestant monarchs. So,
yes,
yes, but
dying for your religion, both sides had that experience. And one thing that I think is so interesting, as Paul mentioned, it had to be at this time during Elizabeth's reign. If you were going to be a practicing Catholic, you probably still went to the Anglican church to show up and keep the law, perhaps practice secretly. But I have read, and I will tell you, I've read conflicting histories, people very determined that they are correct, but their opinions are opposite. But there is a theory that the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, which you can see if you think it through, could have some very religious themes, that this was a Catholic liturgy. It was one of the ways that the Catholic parents taught their children about Catholicism, but they're singing it as a Christmas song. And one partridge in a pear tree, two turtle doves, three French hens. You can find allusions that you can see could track to the New Testament from a Catholic perspective. So it's very interesting the kinds of ways people practice their faith sort of under the radar when the monarchs, prior to Elizabeth, it was Mary who was a Catholic. And so, the monarch's religion tended to dictate the country's religion, and that swung back and
definitely.
forth for a bit.
Yes.
Now, there is some scuttlebutt about how Shakespeare himself and his father were suspected of being uh, underground Catholics. How did that factor into some of the works of Shakespeare or the perception of Shakespeare?
Well, and besides that perception, there are some people, there's one author who has a book about Shakespeare's tribe, where he argues that there were some Christians in England during his lifetime who um, were kind of like Rodney King after the Los Angeles riots. Why can't we all get along? So Shakespeare being one of the good fellows who just wanted to get along. But certainly his plays show that he's more sympathetic to monks and friars sometimes than other playwrights of the time, and he quotes the Bible more often. But yeah, but people have made arguments both ways, saying that he was more Protestant than Catholic, or more Catholic than Protestant, and it is a little bit of a dead end feeling of an argument at times.
Well, he did always, his plays always had to make it through the censor.
Yes,
So probably deliberately watered down anything that could pin him down, which leaves us as readers centuries on unable to really pin him down.
right.
Is that part of the enduring power of Shakespeare? Is that, something about Shakespeare that, just to step away from religion for a second, that makes it so enduring more so than, let's say, Marlowe or some of the other contemporaries, is that there's a certain vagary in Shakespeare that it's universal, but you can't quite pin his villains as being villains because they're so sympathetic. And you can't quite say that his heroes are always so lily white or so blameless, because there's some gray in the heroes as well. So in is this idea of Shakespeare being a chameleon of sorts, to hide potentially his religious leanings, does that factor into the manner in which he manifests his works to be a little bit elusive?
I think that there are two ways to take that. And one way is that the ambiguity is like a Rorschach blot, and people can project onto it whatever they like, and they enjoy that. And certainly, when Ophelia is going crazy in Hamlet, there's a servant who comes in and I think says something to the effect of, well, people who hear her, they botch up her words to fit their own thoughts. And so Shakespeare knew that people are going to interpret him that way. But another observation I would make is that, for example, in the Bible, and this is a story with which Shakespeare's time would be very familiar because they loved reading the Bible and they had to go to church. There's this story of the Gerasene demoniac. Jesus meets him and says, "What's your name?" And so they think he's asking the demon his name because then he can have some power over him. And the man says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And nowadays, people who hear that story, they think, "Oh, maybe the demoniac had multiple personality disorder." But the interesting thing to me about that tale is the people who are writing the gospel are living in dangerous times, and they wrote the gospel mostly in Greek. And they could have used a Greek word instead of legion, but they used this word legion, which is a Latinate word, and it also happens to be a word associated with the occupying Roman army. So
Hmm.
it's as if the story is saying the occupying Roman army in the Holy Land is like a bunch of demons who deserve to be cast out into a herd of swine and rush over a cliff to their deaths. This seems to be, there's evidence in many cultures where there's repression and censorship that people try to find ways to speak truths and criticize the occupying forces or the oppressors. So that seems to be what's going on in that tale. And so, because of that, I tend to think maybe there are similar instances in Shakespeare where there is ambiguity, but the purpose is not to achieve a Rorschach blot, but rather to conceal other possible messages.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Interesting. And he often will look to past civilizations like Rome and Julius Caesar to call into question leadership and power, where he
Yeah.
can say to the censors, "Oh, I'm not talking about our country or our time," which was illegal. He was not allowed to address the religious or political situation of his day. But he could write about the same thing happening hundreds of years before. So
Definitely.
again, yeah, get past the censors. These stories tend to be true over time.
Now, Paul, you mentioned something that before we started the discussion, the recording of the discussion, you mentioned something about how you had analyzed some of the scripture coming into this meeting. Is there anything that you wanted to throw at us before we move on to a different topic?
Sure. I had such a wonderful, I'm so glad that you invited me to do this because it gave me the opportunity to do some preparation, which involved reading the Some of the Bible tales that were scheduled for the 12 days of Christmas in the Book of Common Prayer, in the edition for Elizabethan England that Shakespeare would have been familiar with. And there were all kinds of wonderful things like, um, and I also did some word searches. So I looked for how many times the word nativity occurs 15 times in Shakespeare. And one of them is a humorous exchange in Henry IV, Part 1, in which Glendower brags to Hotspur about the signs in the heavens at his own nativity,
Mm.
which people of the time would say, oh, kind of like the Magi and the star. But Hotspur bursts his bubble with humorous disbelief, saying, oh, those signs in the heavens would have happened anyway, even if you hadn't been born. It may have been heretical to criticize the Bible story about the Magi and the signs in the heavens, but if Shakespeare tells a humorous story about Glendower being full of pride and bragging, he can pop that bubble with Hotspur. So kind of in a way that Carol was suggesting with the use of the analogies from other cultures and things like that. There are a number of tales in Shakespeare where there are shepherds mentioned. So, for example, and when we think about the incarnation, the idea of oh, this God is going to go incognito, disguised as the son of a carpenter in Nazareth or born in Bethlehem and all this stuff. Well, in Winter's Tale, we have not a prince, but a princess who is unrecognized and adopted by shepherds and later we find that she's a royal princess. There's definitely something going on there with a connection to the nativity motifs. There's also a tale in Measure for Measure. Vincentio says that I'm going to grab this. Vincentio. He says something to the effect of he mentions a star and shepherds, I think, but let me grab that.
We'll let you
Uh,
grab that. Go ahead.
okay. So, Julia in Measure for Measure, Juliet is pregnant by Claudio, and the Jesus nativity tale is in part a story about the Virgin Mary being pregnant out of wedlock and some possible shame related to that. Measure for Measure, we have Juliet pregnant out of wedlock by Claudio, and Vincentio says, look, the unfolding star calls up the shepherd. Well, Shakespeare knows what he's doing there by mentioning the star and the shepherd in this tale about an unwed pregnant mother. And we we need to realize if the Holy Family had lived in Shakespeare's Vienna, the setting of that play, the couple might have been given the death penalty for Mary having conceived a child out of wedlock. So we wouldn't necessarily read that play and say, well, that's a Christmas play, obviously. We tend not to do that. And yet there are those themes that seem charged with these motifs.
And I'm sure the audience of Shakespeare's day would have a much more direct connection to that than we might
Yes,
several hundred years later. Now,
yes,
Carol Ann, given all of your work in your books, especially your recent book that just came out, and it's a wonderful stocking stuffer, Courting the Virgin Queen, what would you say is there any way we can pin down Elizabeth I in terms of her religious leanings? Her father, of course, was very adamant that he wanted to separate from the church largely because he wanted to divorce his wives. But is there anything that we see from Elizabeth herself in terms of how she directs Christianity during her reign?
During Elizabeth's reign, she tried to walk a fine line. She certainly was not going to carry on her half sister Mary's return to Catholicism. So she did reestablish the Church of England. She became not the supreme head, but the supreme governor of the Church of England. She was not, as a woman, able to be recognized necessarily as a head of the church. She couldn't hold an office in the church. So governor was a compromise. She was actually very fond of some of the Catholic practices, so she sought to retain some of those in her reign. She also retained some of the Catholic servants and privy counselors from Mary, not some of the more extreme ones, but certainly she is famous not to have said, but to have been the person who someone was speaking about when Bacon said she did not wish to make windows into men's souls. So she didn't want to go as far as the Puritans wanted her to go. She frustrated the Puritans. She didn't want to go as far as the Catholics wanted her to go. She frustrated the Catholics. She wanted to maintain more of a middle way.
Yes.
And try to politically and religiously keep things from sort of coming up to the boiling point that unfortunately it did later in her reign when Mary Queen of Scots was there, and things really did come to a heightened state with Mary Queen of Scots and then Philip sending the Armada. But for a long time, she really tried to keep the sort of out of men's souls, stay true to the crown and believe what you want when you go home and close the door.
Okay, all right. And did that manifest itself in terms of how the churches were run, or did the churches maintain their status and she just kind of said, kind of kept a hand away from it as much as she could?
As time went on, the both persecution and prosecution of Catholics increased. So the first 10 years of her reign, there was a fine, but it wasn't very much if you didn't go to church. As time went on and there were greater and more significant Catholic threats from the time Mary Queen of Scots arose, the Northern Uprising, all Throckmorton plot, those plots to replace Elizabeth with a Catholic monarch, there was a greater sort of clamping down on Catholics. And there was martyrdom of Catholics, as Paul mentioned earlier, just as there had been martyrdom of Protestants earlier.
Okay. All right. So, folks, we are going to take a brief pause while we all go freshen up, have a drink of water, and we'll come back with a little bit more of discussion about New York. I'm sorry, the New York Shakespeare Christmas special about Shakespeare and Christmas. We'll be right back with more discussion.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, folks, we are back. We took a little water break. We have all freshened up. I think Paul and Carol Ann might have swapped seats, but other than that, we are we are all ready to go with the continuation of this discussion. So before we took our little break, we were touching on the point of Shakespeare perhaps purposefully putting some ambiguity into his writings in a possible way to conceal some political or religious orientations of his own. It brings to mind the idea of contemporary TV shows or movies where sometimes they'll put something that's a little bit risque in there or a little bit borderline offensive, but they'll keep it just safe enough to get by the censor. So PG-13 doesn't become a rated R, or rated R doesn't become rated X, or whatever the case is, NC-17. But I think that might be a similar idea with Shakespeare, where in some of the cases, he's putting some things in that might be a little bit dangerous, politically dangerous in terms of the line between Protestantism and Catholicism, and evading the censors. And maybe the audience, one of the reasons they keep on coming back so often to the theater, to the Globe, is to see what did he manage to sneak in.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just occurred to me, if you look at the Scottish play, I'm not in a theater, so I guess I could say Macbeth, I'm just in my house, but and the whole discussion of equivocation, and that word is used over and over, which would, for Shakespeare's audience, call to mind the way that some of the religion is being so politicized and used as a way of tamping down, and the failure of the gunpowder plot, but the way of using it, what could have happened as a tool to really enforce one religious society. And equivocation would have been a really powerful word. But again, it's in this play about hundreds of years ago, so we can't possibly be writing about today. So that's an example of that.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
equivocation usually associated with the Jesuits
Yes.
mastering the art of equivocation because it was unsafe times for Catholics, and so
Mm-hmm.
they thought they had to equivocate.
Yes.
There you
Yes.
go, and that's one of the things that appears often in Shakespeare's plays, the equivocation, and the idea that perhaps Shakespeare himself or his father were equivocators in the sense that they were feigning Protestantism in public and being secret Catholics underneath. Okay, so while we're still on the
Maybe.
topic of that religious connotation, let's take a look at Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare's plays, one of the things that made them perhaps so popular and so different for the Elizabethan audience is how much of an evolution they were from the previous morality plays that were the standard form of maybe 50 to 75 years before Shakespeare's time. So either of you, you want to say anything to tell us about how Shakespeare evolved and took the simple idea of the morality play and expanded it into the fertile, rich plays that we still debate and discuss and theorize about 400 plus years later?
Well, Carol Ann probably knows more than I do about this, but they say that there were in the medieval times there were morality plays, but also mystery plays and miracle plays, and some scholars have studied extensively about how Elizabethan theater took things a step further and avoided the evangelization or the overt kind of Christianizing and moralizing, but tried to entertain and to be thought-provoking in ways that sort of danced around these things. But except for, maybe the return of the enlivening of the statue of Hermione in A Winter's Tale, and the appearance of the goddess Hymen, I think. We don't get many miracles. We get a pretend miracle in King Lear, but it's staged.
The miracle plays and morality plays, they were really very simple expressions of religious beliefs, the seven deadly sins, the an angelic figure, things like that. So as you mentioned, Paul, we do have some deities that come in. You have Hymen that comes in. What's the expression for it? You have the god of the machine, the Deus ex
Oh, yes.
machina, that
Mhm.
comes in into some of the plays where all of a sudden some magical, for the lack of a better term, event will come in to save the heroes from the certain disaster that's about to befall them. So maybe there's an evolution in that sense as well.
Yeah, maybe a
Okay,
bear, maybe some pirates.
Yeah,
uh,
right. Well, and
right.
just the evolution of theater and playmaking with a permanent stage, with a building that is dedicated to being a theater that allows a little more, I mean, not elaborate, but a little more of some special effects or, a hell that is below the stage or a heaven that is above, those kinds of things also certainly Shakespeare made full use of in telling his stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So, Paul, one of the things that we had spoken about earlier is you drew some very interesting connections with Herod and how that might how that might inject itself into the discussion of Shakespeare and Christmas. What could you say about Herod?
Sure. Yes, on the fourth day of Christmas, December 28th, people in Shakespeare's lifetime would observe the Feast of the Holy Innocents, which involves the tale of Herod the Great, um, not the Herod who orders the beheading of John the Baptist. That's his son Herod Antipas. But Herod the Great orders the killing of all boys 2 years and younger, because he hears that there's a new king who's been born, and he wants to eliminate the competition, any possible heirs to his throne, which sounds like a Shakespeare theme. It sounds like Richard III and princes in the tower. Let's get rid of the competition. So that gospel tale seems to have been written to echo Pharaoh of Egypt ordering the killing of Hebrew infant boys. And so, of course, remove prospective heirs or competitors. We know that the killing of heirs or competitors is a repeated theme in Shakespeare, certainly in Richard III, but also in Hamlet and Richard II and in Macbeth. By the numbers, I have to say that, Carol. I, I owe that to Carol. By the numbers, the word Herod occurs 8 times in Shakespeare in 4 plays, and 5 of those occur in Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra lived at the same time as Herod the Great, and in the second scene of the play, Act 1, Scene 2, a servant says, "Let me be married to 3 kings in a forenoon and widow them all." Widow them all, maybe poison them. Let me have a child at 50 to whom Herod of Jewry may do homage. So we hear not only the name of Herod, but also 3 kings, and you can bet that Shakespeare's audiences noticed that. So there's a definite
Absolutely. I think Shakespeare's audience was more oral and than we are today. We're more visual. They had a much better comprehension of what they were hearing at that time. And I think the actors spoke at a more rapid pace than we are accustomed to today. So they were accustomed to taking in a lot of information from what they were hearing. And I'm sure they drew plenty of those connections that you referred to. There was another quote that you were telling us about, Paul. What was that one?
Yes, I was thinking about this general idea of Christmas as what has been theologically been termed the incarnation. And there's a moment in toward the end of Midsummer Night's Dream when Theseus says, "The poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." And that to me seems to paraphrase the idea of the incarnation. Instead of God the Father becoming incarnate in the Son Jesus, who's born human on earth, God in his heaven in this airy nothing. The poet takes the airy nothings and gives them a local habitation and a name. So it seems Shakespeare is thinking analogically that poets are incarnational in the way that God is incarnational. And that's connected in a deep way, not a superficial way, to the idea of Christmas.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. That's really fantastic. So, as if there's the divine right of kings. Maybe there's a divine pen, a divine quill that Shakespeare is wielding as as the writer of these
I think
verses.
that's reflected in the sonnets because he talks about what he creates will outlive mortality. So there's some creation going on there too, I think, very
Yes,
consciously.
Absolutely.
definitely.
So that teases something that one of the central themes that we want to talk about today is Carol, of course, with your book Courting the Virgin Queen, you go into tremendous depth of some of the ins and outs of the life of Elizabeth I and in her journey from a young child to being the one of the most celebrated queens or regents of English history. The idea that the persona that she takes on of the Virgin Queen.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, why don't you give us a quick summary of how that comes about? But secondly, does that incorporate the idea of Virgin Mary, and does it give her almost a status of a deity in the throne? As we mentioned, the divine right of kings, the divine holy queen, who is both a political leader and a religious leader.
I think it definitely does. And one of the things we see prior to Henry VIII and the break with Rome is very much an honoring and worshiping of Virgin Mary as an icon, and a lot of iconography related to that and the artwork surrounding that. And in the time of the Tudors, we see a lot more portraiture, portraits of people, as the shift is by law directed away during the reign of Henry VIII and on, especially with Edward, of getting rid of some of this iconography. And these very sad to those of us who would love to see the churches in their original forms with the beautiful paintings on the wall that were literally painted over during Shakespeare's time. We know his father was tasked with that at Stratford, with painting over some of the beautiful representations of things like the Virgin Mary. So there was a lack of that by the time we get to Elizabeth's reign. And as she decided not to be the lovely virgin who is then going to get married and be a bride, she decided to remain a virgin. She did step into some of that iconography of the virgin and associate herself with the power that comes through that notion of virginity and the virgin that is there to be worshiped. One of the things that her ministers were constantly pressing on her, and you can see why, is the lack of an heir. If you decide not to get married, you cannot have children in those days, full stop. So then who's next? And of course, throughout the Tudors, that question of who's next is huge, because that's the only way the dynasty can continue. So Elizabeth can be seen in the end to almost be attempting, as she drapes herself with pearls and these portraits of her that are just dripping with this iconography of the Virgin. She is holding the sieve, which is part of the story of the Vestal Virgin and the purity, as if she will live forever, as if there's no need for an heir. Of course, she is human and not deity, so that doesn't work. But she really does try and pull that off for as long as she can, and uses the existing desire to worship the Virgin to turn that to worship of herself. I think that absolutely happens. Yes.
And judging by the fact that her reign is one of the most celebrated, one of the ones that we still talk about 450 plus years later, and one of the times of relative peace and calm and stability in England during centuries where there was so much tumult and so much chaos. The fact that she was able to marry those two worlds, the religious world and the political world, in the persona of the Virgin Queen, maybe that was the ultimate way of bringing all those worlds together.
Yes. And it's quite extraordinary that she was nearly 70 when she died, which for those days, not today, but in those days, was quite old. And she died peacefully in her bed. So, as did the Tudors, all managed to hold their thrones until Edward died very young of an illness, but none of them were deposed or, defeated in battle. So the Tudors actually had quite a long record of successfully holding the throne, and Elizabeth held it longest of all.
And it might be Edmund Spenser with the Fairy
Mhm.
Queen that really helped promote the idea of the Virgin Queen as well. So it wasn't maybe just a matter of self-promotion, but a matter of people around Elizabeth who promoted her as such. So,
The
Absolutely.
the best PR firm of the day,
Yes. Yes.
the
Sure.
best spin doctors of the time, and absolutely that's a lot of what it was creating the image to convey to the public, and
Mhm.
that's the idea of the Virgin Queen still carries on centuries later. All right, so we have come to the end of our Christmas special. We want to give a huge, huge thank you to Carol Ann Lloyd and to Paul Adrian Freed. Of course, you can go and find Carol Ann's books, Tudors by the Numbers and Courting the Virgin Queen. Run down this second, run to Barnes and Noble, bang on their doors, make sure they don't close before the holiday starts, and grab that book. If not, you can order it on Amazon or wherever you can find the books, and you can have it sent to you by the end of the 12 days of Christmas, and it'll still count as a Christmas gift based on tradition. And Paul, of course, Paul Adrian Freed, he has his wonderful blog series, Hamlet's Bible. You can join him online to connect with all those. Of course, you can also listen to Carol Ann's podcasts, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Do I have that right?
That's right.
Am I mixing one of the R's up? I know there's
No,
three.
that's perfect.
Okay, all right. And you can find her on Instagram at Shake Up History.
Mhm.
Paul Freed, you can find him on Instagram at Hamlet's Bible. And of course, you can connect with us at New York Shakespeare across social media. We try to bring you all the latest happenings in the world of Shakespeare in New York. But of course, at the end of the year, we like to sit down with some of our favorite scholars for the Spotlight on Education series to enlighten you and enlighten ourselves about some of the ins and outs of Shakespeare and the Elizabethan era. So, Carol and Lloyd, Paul, Adrian, Freed, are there any parting words you want to say? Any direction you want to give our viewers as to where they can connect with you outside of Instagram?
At Shake Up History. And I just want to thank you for having me on and wish everyone a really happy history holidays. Hope all your dreams come true in the new year.
Wonderful. Paul?
Best wishes for the season. And yes, you can connect with me on um, the the social media formerly known as Twitter, and also on I'll get to Blue Sky eventually, I'm sure, and also on Instagram as you said, Rodney, and on LinkedIn and on my blog. But thank you so much for having us. This has been such a pleasure.
So fun. Been
It's
wonderful.
always a delight. It's always a joy, and I feel like if there was no time limits, we could speak about this for hours. But as we mentioned in the beginning, some fella somewhere once said, "Brevity is the soul of wit." So we'll try to keep it brief. So we wish you a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, a Happy New Year, and we will see you with more great Shakespeare content in the new year, including our year in review. So keep an eye out for that. Carol and Paul, I thank you so much. And to our Shakespeare audience, support your local Shakespeare, whatever that means for you, especially if it means buying Carol Ann's books and reading Paul's blogs. So have a great night. Merry Christmas, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Merry
You too.
Christmas, everyone. Good night.